We have the chat room for you up next, and it takes you back, well, to the very, very first days of Melbourne and one particular part of our community that's had a presence here for longer than you think.
You're in the chat room with Virginia Trioli.
And we're taking you back to the earliest days of Melbourne to look at a part of our community that's often been spoken of in terms of post-World War II migration. But what about the Jewish community in 19th century Melbourne? A really interesting university thesis has been turned into a book. It's called A Networked Community, Jewish Melbourne in the 19th Century. Its author is Sue Silberberg, and she joins you now. Sue, good morning. Good to talk to you.
Good morning, Virginia.
This is a really fascinating piece of Victorian and Melbourne history because Jews in Melbourne go all the way back to that very first lot of entrepreneurial Tasmanians who would not be told no by the Governor of New South Wales, who was saying, no, you can't come over the water and settle that little bit of land there down in the bay and by the river. You mustn't do it. And they said, yeah, we will. And that had a Jewish connection all the way back then.
Yes, the Solomons, who were in fact convicts to Tasmania, were some of the investors in the Port Phillip settlement. So right as with the settlement of Australia, Jews were on the First Fleet, Jews were at the establishment of Melbourne as well. So yes, the presence of Jews in Melbourne is very old and not always necessarily seen.
Well, I've got to say, I did not know about it until reading your book, so it's a really fascinating bit of history. So tell us about the Jewish emancipist Joseph Solomon.
Joseph and his brother Judah Solomon were convicted for a complicated crime involving stealing from the father-in-law of one of the brothers. They were sent to Tasmania, but what was interesting is they came with £50, and that £50 facilitated their establishment of a business which led to them becoming quite wealthy.
What was the business?
They were traders, traders in Tasmania, selling things, which is predominantly what Jews did in early Australia. And they were therefore able to buy land when Victoria was settled. They were able to be early investors in Victoria as much as they were in Tasmania.
So were they some of the early purchasers of the land lots in Melbourne that were sold?
Yes, so from the first land sales they were purchasing in Melbourne, as were other Jewish settlers, such as the Benjamin family, who were also very early settlers.
Do we know any of the lots that they bought?
We do. They're marked on maps, but the lots are very big lots. So Melbourne was laid out so the lots were from the big streets, the main streets to the little streets. So they were buying lots all over the place. People were buying lots all over the place as investments, and then those lots have been subdivided till we get the size of lots that we see today.
Any particularly famous corners or parts of the streets that we might remember today or identify with, Sue?
Well, what I'm particularly interested in is the parts of the streets that we don't necessarily see as Jewish, which are where Jews often, although there was no concept of a ghetto in any form, Jews tended to live close to family members, and there are certain parts of Melbourne that do become predominantly Jewish, such as the part of Victoria Parade, where all the hospitals are now.
Oh, yeah.
That part of Victoria Parade. A little street in Fitzroy in the 1860s has some very interesting Jewish families in it. King William Street, parts of Albert Street, East Melbourne. So you get these pockets of Jewish sort of interconnected families living in particular areas of Melbourne.
And so then did Jews from various parts of the world then feel like this was a place that they could migrate to? Were they drawn then to Melbourne because of this original connection to the Jewish community in the first settlers? The
first settlers were, and throughout the 19th century, they were overwhelmingly English settlers.
Yes.
So they're coming, as with anybody else, as English settlers. And but the gold rush, of course, encouraged people to come from all over the world. So the gold rush then brought people in more widely. The second largest group of Jewish immigrants were from what became Germany, and then from further into Eastern Europe. But you get Jews arriving from Turkey, from Gibraltar, from the Caribbean, from North America. So they're coming from everywhere, but they are predominantly English.
I know you mentioned in the history Jews from the Caribbean. Tell us about that.
I'm interested in Jews from the Caribbean.
I did not know about Jews from the Caribbean,
yes,
can I say?
In the earlier periods, there were actually more Jews in the Caribbean than there were in what were the American colonies.
Really?
And they were largely Sephardi Jews, so Jews whose origins came from Spain. And they were settled there. It's a complicated and long story about the settlement of Jamaica itself, which is predominantly where they were. They were in other islands as well, but the ones in Australia predominantly come from Jamaica. Because Jamaica, although it belonged to Spain until the English took it, it was outside the Inquisition. So Jews could live there secretly, and after the British took it, they expelled the Spanish, but kept the Jews were allowed to stay, and they called them Portuguese. And after the English took it in the 17th century, they were able to openly practice as Jews. And so, but they were always taxed disproportionately, and they were disenfranchised. And it wasn't till the end of slavery that Jews were enfranchised with everybody else. But is quite a significant Jewish population there. It's estimated to have been up to 10% or something of the white population, and a number of those Jewish families, again very interconnected, chose to migrate to Australia.
It's a really fascinating bit of history that I think many of us are learning today, so thank you for that. Sue Silberberg is with you in the chat room, author of A Networked Community, Jewish Melbourne in the 19th Century. Yes, the 19th century, from the very, very early days. One of the key features of Jewish communities in history and around the world is their proximity to each other. You use the word networked there, and the fact that they like to stay close, they like to stay connected. They identify with each other as Jews. Was that the case in the early years of Melbourne too?
Well, it depends quite how you define that. They certainly identified as Jews, and they certainly liked to marry each other. Mm-hmm. But that was a more complicated story because, of course, and I'll come back to this, there were actually almost very, very few Jewish women in Victoria, but they certainly saw themselves as part of the wider community. And so they don't see themselves as separate to the community, they see themselves as Jews and as part of Melbourne's general community.
And as you say, no particular ghetto established
No
here.
ghettos established. And what's very interesting for me is how they express that in very public ways. So, for example, as early as 1856, you get ads in the Melbourne papers with Hebrew typeface, advertising things like matzah for Passover. Now, to do that, you obviously have to have typeface that's in Hebrew. Yeah. So they have their communal disputes in the Melbourne papers. So they're very much a part of the community and an element of the community. I think where they place their buildings is also interesting. So they're there if you think of where currently the second iteration of the East Melbourne Hebrew congregation, the Synagogue in Albert Street that's in the political and religious heartland of Melbourne, next to Parliament House, next to the Catholic Cathedral, next to a whole variety of Catholic
churches. Did they establish synagogues very early?
Very early. They were certainly holding services before they established the synagogues, but the first synagogue in Melbourne was established in 1844, which is the Melbourne Hebrew congregation that is now situated behind Melbourne Grammar in Toorak. So by the 1870s, there were in fact 6 synagogues in Victoria, and other little communities trying to hold services in mining areas where they didn't actually build synagogues, but they were borrowing religious items from the Melbourne metropolitan synagogues to support their at least important festivals.
Listen to this text, Sue Silberberg, this has come in. My London Jewish family had property in the West Indies in the 1700s. My great-great-grandfather came here in the 1850s and lived in Ballarat.
Lovely.
There you go.
Yeah.
Which is exactly the history you're talking about.
Yeah. And then you have families like the Montefiores who are here, very significant, wealthy, connected families that had bases in Barbados, for example.
Mm. Wow, it's so fascinating. So we know a great deal about the early, wealthy, successful days of settled Melbourne. We're talking here, of course, about colonised Melbourne and not about its very ancient history. I'm assuming here that, you know, a lot of Jewish families, and you write about them in the book, you know, did well and made a social success of themselves here. How has that affected contemporary Melbourne? What connections to that 19th century time and impact of that particular wave of migration can we see still playing out in Melbourne?
Well, the fundamental infrastructure of Jewish Melbourne is what these communities founded. They founded a philanthropic society, which then built an almshouse, which is now a huge Jewish welfare community of Jewish care that has, you know, nursing homes and old people's homes around Melbourne. They, excuse me, they built synagogues, they built burial, you know, they had a burial society. So all the fundamental infrastructure that a Jewish community requires had to be built from scratch by this community. And this community, being English, built it from their perspectives. And I think that's really important to understand, that these were English Jews, they weren't Eastern European Jews, they were products of the Enlightenment, they came from a society where they were very largely emancipated, and the very last parts of political emancipation were playing out as they were arriving. And so they saw themselves as a part of the community, but very much religiously connected back to the chief rabbi of the Ashkenazi community in London, and the Sephardi community connected basically through them as well, but they had their own rights for a long time in Victoria.
Sue Silberberg, there's a movie in this.
Yes.
There really is a movie. There are great characters, big personalities, and I could see this being turned into something really quite spectacular. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Sue Silberberg, who's the author of A Networked Community, Jewish Melbourne in the 19th Century. It is a thesis, so it's presented to you in the book in that form, rather than sort of being written as a rollicking piece of history. But the history is in there, and it rewards attention.